So thank you everyone for joining us. This is kind of an after set where I get to ask some questions from Dr. Harris as one of the key people who've developed the term race lighting to refer to what happens when gaslighting is racial for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So, Dr. Harris, first of all, for those who haven't been as engaged as they would like to be, first of all, what is race lighting?
Yeah, race lighting is the phenomenon you experience when there's an attempt to gaslight you, or when you are gaslit, but it's done so within a racialized context. So, for example, let's say I experience racism or experience a racial microaggression, and I bring it to someone's attention or articulate that this is something I've experienced. And the response that I get is one that makes me second guess what I've experienced, one that makes it seem as though I'm the problem and not what I've experienced is the problem. Anything that kind of takes the onus in terms of responsibility and intervention from the person who did it and puts it back on me can often result in being race-lit. And so I think one of the common threads, regardless of how it occurs, is the second guessing, the doubt, the disorientation, the self-blame. So you're wondering, well, maybe I didn't experience what I thought I experienced, or maybe I'm the problem, or maybe I'm being too sensitive. When you start to internalize, the responses that you get in a way that makes it seem as though you've done something wrong, or that you're the source of the problem.
Now, I'm sure a lot of people, when they hear this, they're thinking to themselves, wow, you just described and gave a term to what I've been experiencing my whole life. I just didn't know how to talk about it. And so race lighting really gives people a language, almost like microaggression does for some of the micro messages that we receive. So how did you come up with the concept of race lighting?
Well, I think it's important to recognize this. We live in a racially salient society. And so, Black and Indigenous people of color think about race, are reminded that we're racial minorities.
Every day.
All the time, every day, sometimes very explicitly, and sometimes more subtly, right? So we sort of have to recognize and understand that experiencing racial microaggressions and experiencing race lighting is in many ways a part of being, a racially minoritized person in the current U.S. context, right? We have to accept that as a given. And so, how did we come up with the idea? How did we come up with the concept? I think it's in some ways, to respond to that question, we have to think about, well, when did we come up with it? And it was in the middle of, June of 2020, right around that time, in the middle of the racial reckoning that occurred, following the tragic murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and far too many others, to name. And so we were thinking about it at that time because it was what was going on. We heard people say, well, if George didn't try to use a counterfeit $20 bill, then that wouldn't have happened to him. Or if he wouldn't have if he would have not resisted arrest, then he wouldn't have been murdered. And we heard all these things. If he would have
just have complied.
If he would have just complied, exactly. We started to hear all these attributions for why he was murdered, when in fact there was nothing that he did that justified what happened to him. And so, while that is, kind of the most extreme and in many ways one of the most tragic cases or, examples of, race lighting, we know that we experience micro race lighting or smaller versions of that every day, all the time. And so I think we were just trying to make sense of what we were observing, but also making sense of what we were experiencing at the time.
So victim blaming.
Victim blaming is a key part of that. What I would also add to it? The transference of responsibility, right?
Ooh,
so if I say something or do something that's racist or that race lights someone, what often happens is instead of someone saying, hey, you know what, that's right, I did say something, I did do something that maybe it didn't come across the way that I expected it to or intended it to, but it was wrong. right? And it was something that shouldn't have happened. The response is no, I didn't say that, or I didn't do that, or there's this attempt to transfer responsibility for dealing with it to the person who's experienced it, right? So you deal with it. I said it, I started it, but I'm going to leave you to deal with the effects and figure out how to cope with it, right? Rather than accepting responsibility and accountability for it.
So
That's
how does
also
that make
part
people
of it.
feel?
Well, I think, with all race lighting, in some ways it makes folks feel alone. It makes people of color feel as though they did something wrong. It makes people of color feel as though their lives and their experiences are not of value or of worth. And so there's a range of feelings and responses that often results from race lighting, those being some examples of them.
And I think that could happen both for the person who is the individual who's receiving that message,
course,
right?
of course.
But it can also happen to like the larger community. Like if you can keep on seeing these things on the TV, you mentioned all these names: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery.
Yeah.
Like there's this overwhelming sense that maybe it's us.
Right.
Maybe there's something wrong with us. Maybe there's something that we're not doing. And that's that race lighting, right? We start to second guess ourselves and think that we're crazy. And really, it's this victim blaming and transference of responsibility that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate way to describe the phenomenon. And then, what I also think happens? We haven't talked a lot about this, but what happens when there's like repeated exposure to the same racialized stressors, right? When you're seeing the same thing over and over and over again, right? The same acts of racism or acts of racial microaggressions, when you're seeing them happening over and over again to different people and in different contexts, but essentially the same thing. Well, sometimes you could start to wonder, okay, well, it's happening here and it's happening over there and it's happening over there. So maybe it is something that we're doing, right? Maybe it is people of color's fault. Maybe we do need to kind of, engage and think and act differently, right? Maybe something is wrong with us, right? And so I think an example of that, again, right? I mean, I think, between, obviously, people of color have been killed by law enforcement for centuries, right? That is not a new phenomenon. But I felt as though 2020, 2021, maybe even going as far back as, around 2012 with Trayvon Martin, that we start to see it more. And it's sort of the same type of thing, to the point people say that you become desensitized to it. I don't know that it's a desensitization. I think the repeated exposure to it sometimes wires your brain and changes your perception and make you think differently. You're like, okay, this keeps happening, so there has to be some other explanation, because the explanation that makes the most sense doesn't seem to, change anything.
So it's that second guessing.
Yeah, yep.
Dang.
Yeah.
So repeated trauma around these issues, seeing these things, 2012, obviously
Right.
before that, Rodney King,
Yeah.
right, is the one that originally comes to my mind.
Right, yeah. Yep.
Right, all the way up to this present day. It's that reinforcing this narrative that there's something that's wrong with us.
Right.
When in reality, it's not us, it's them. But that can be so hard to overcome that when it's continuously being portrayed like that in the media. And certain media portrays that even more harshly than others,
Right.
as a way of trying to portray Black and indigenous people in particular as criminals, as dangerous, as deviant, as up to no good. And I also in some ways connects to the work that we've been doing looking at exclusionary discipline with suspensions and expulsions, right?
Yeah. Yeah, when we look at rates of suspension and expulsions in our public K-12 schools, it's a lot of, right? It's the same kids, right? Same kids in terms of, it's Black, it's Latino, it's indigenous, it's, foster youth, right? It's the most vulnerable kids and the most disproportionately impacted and underserved kids, and kind of being suspended or expelled for a lot of the same things, willful defiance, and things that oftentimes don't seem to rise to the level of a suspension or expulsion, or suspensions. It's one thing for one kid to be suspended one time, but what we often see in our work is that it's not one suspension per. It's not 100 kids each get suspended one time. It's 25 or 30 kids each getting suspended multiple times.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, it's the same pattern that kind of recycles itself. It's almost like once you get on the bad list, then in many ways it's like policing. Once you get tagged as being bad or being a criminal, then it's really hard to first and foremost change the perception of that. But secondly, the cycle of punishment continues to recycle, and each time the punishment gets harsher and harsher and harsher.
Well, what that reminds me of is labeling, right?
Yeah.
And we see this even in the earliest levels of schooling. You can see kids in preschool
Right.
who are called bad, physical, hyper, aggressive, defiant, deregulated, hyperactive, right? And educators will take those terms and they'll attach it to a young child, and then the other children will start to refer to that child with those same terms, and the other teachers will start to refer to that child with those same terms, and it becomes so attached to that child that we just assume that Jamal is a troublemaker, that Derek is bad, when in reality it's not them, it's the people who are bad are really the ones who have attached the label to them that doesn't belong there for a kid who's in preschool.
Right.
I remember when Tyrone Howard, he was on the first Black Minds Matter program that we ever did, and he said, the child hasn't been on the planet but for 36 months, and they're already being labeled. And so I think about that labeling. Do you think that labeling process also relates to race lighting in some way?
Yeah, I do, right? And so we're talking about this in a preschool context, right, or early childhood context. But what about in education, in higher education? That's the troublemaking professor, right? Stay away from her, right? That colleague is an angry Black woman. She's always complaining. Stay away from her, right? And so I think it in some ways it operates similarly to this pattern that you just described, with the labeling of children, and how that creates a vicious cycle of race lighting as well.